My husband disappeared with all our savings when I was pregnant. I was left with nothing. But the lawyer called me. Ma'am, your first husband from 2015 died and left you $112 million. But on the condition that you... Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say you know when something is wrong, that some quiet voice inside you tries to warn you before the disaster arrives. I believe that now. But back then, back when my life still looked like something worth envying from the outside, I didn't listen to that voice. I told myself I was being paranoid, hormonal, irrational. I had a habit of doing that, talking myself out of my own instincts. My name is Megan Claire Hartwell, or at least that was the name on my driver's license in the spring of 2023, when everything fell apart. I was 34 years old, 7 months pregnant, living in a 3-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio, and I was married to a man named Derek Voss. On paper, we were doing well. Derek worked in commercial real estate. I had spent 8 years as a financial analyst before I went part-time when the pregnancy got complicated. We had a joint savings account with a little over $94,000 in it. We had a mortgage, 2 cars, and a weekly dinner reservation at an Italian place on 5th Avenue that we both pretended to love more than we actually did. What we didn't have, though I didn't fully understand it yet, was trust. The warning signs had been there for months, quiet as paper cuts. Derek started working late in January. Not every night, but often enough that I noticed. When I mentioned it, he laughed it off. Busy season, babe, you know how it is. And I believed him, because I wanted to. In February, he changed the password on his personal laptop. He said it was a work security update. In March, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a hotel stay in Cincinnati, a Thursday night, when he had told me he was at a conference in Cleveland. When I asked him about it, he looked me directly in the eyes and said the receipt was from a client dinner that ran late, that they had all shared a suite, that I was reading into things because pregnancy hormones made women paranoid. I stood in our kitchen, one hand on my belly, and I told myself he was probably right. That was the cruelest part of being gaslit by someone you love. You become complicit in your own deception. April arrived, and with it, a strange stillness in Derek's behavior. He became almost tender, bringing me tea in the mornings, rubbing my feet in the evenings, asking about my doctor's appointments with sudden attentiveness. I remember thinking, maybe we'd turned a corner. Maybe the distance of the past few months had been stress, and now he was coming back to me. I let myself feel hopeful. I let my guard down completely. On April 19th, a Tuesday, I woke up to an empty bed. Derek's side was cold. His phone was gone from the nightstand. I walked downstairs and found his keys on the kitchen counter. Not his car keys, just the house keys. And a single sticky note that read, "I'm sorry. I can't do this." No explanation. No signature. 5 words. I called his cell phone 14 times. It rang twice the first time, then went straight to voicemail every time after that. I called his office. His assistant, a polite young man named Oliver, told me Derek had submitted his resignation by email the previous Friday. I called his mother, Patricia Voss, a thin, sharp-eyed woman from Dayton who had never particularly liked me. She picked up on the second ring and told me, in a voice so flat it could have been ironed, that she hadn't heard from her son and that I should stop calling. It took me 48 hours to think clearly enough to check our bank account. The savings were gone. All $94,000. Transferred out in 3 separate transactions over the preceding 2 weeks. Small enough, apparently, not to trigger an alert. Carefully timed so I wouldn't notice until it was too late. He had planned this. He had been planning it while he rubbed my feet and brought me chamomile tea and asked me whether we should paint the nursery yellow or green. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, my back against the bed, both hands pressed against my stomach where our daughter was still kicking, steady and oblivious. And I tried to understand how a person does that, how a man looks at his 7 months pregnant wife and chooses to hollow out her life like a piece of rotten fruit and simply walk away. I didn't cry right away. I think I was too stunned for tears. And then my phone rang. The number was a 212 area code, New York. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Some reflex, some automatic reaching for anything that might anchor me to a world that still made sense. Am I speaking with Megan Claire Hartwell? The voice was professional, male, measured. Yes, I said. My own voice sounded far away. Ms. Hartwell, my name is Richard Albrecht. I'm a probate attorney based in Manhattan. I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Thomas Evan Hartwell. A pause. I'm sorry to inform you that Thomas passed away on April 14th, but I need to speak with you urgently about the terms of his will. You are named as the primary beneficiary of an estate valued at approximately $112 million. Another pause, shorter. There is, however, a condition. I stayed on the floor of my bedroom, my hand on my belly, the spring light coming through the curtains, and I thought, what on earth is happening to my life? Thomas Hartwell, my first husband. The man I had divorced in 2017, who I had not spoken to in years, who I had loved once in the uncomplicated way you love someone when you're still young enough to believe love is uncomplicated. $112 million. With a condition. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even tried. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, an old habit from my years as an analyst when I needed to think through a problem. And I wrote down everything I knew, what I had, what I didn't have, what had just happened to me, and what might be about to happen. It helped me feel less like I was drowning and more like I was at least standing waist deep and could still touch the bottom. What I had, the house, which was mortgaged, and the mortgage was in both our names. One car. Derek had taken the newer one, a checking account with $2,300 in it, which was mine alone and which Derek hadn't touched, either because he had overlooked it or because even he had a floor below which he wouldn't sink. My laptop, my professional certifications. 7 weeks until my due date, and apparently pending something called a condition, the possibility of $112 million. What I didn't have, a husband, $94,000 in savings, a clear legal plan, any idea where Derek was, or the emotional bandwidth to process any of this without falling apart completely. I underlined that last item and stared at it. Then I drew a line through it. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth, but I was going to find some anyway. Because here is what I understood, sitting at that kitchen table at 2 a.m. with my daughter pressing her heel against my ribs. Falling apart was a luxury I could not afford. Falling apart was what Derek had counted on. He had chosen his timing deliberately. A pregnant wife, hormonal and physically vulnerable, financially devastated, emotionally blindsided, because he had calculated that I would collapse, that I would spend the next month crying and calling mutual friends and trying to understand why, and that by the time I gathered myself enough to take any legal action, he would be safely untraceable. He had underestimated me. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. The following morning, I made 3 phone calls before 9 a.m. The first was to Richard Albrecht, the probate attorney in New York, to set up a formal meeting. He was available that Friday. The condition attached to Thomas's estate, he explained carefully, was not punitive. It was protective. Thomas had known that his assets would be contested by his business partners and certain family members who had expected to inherit. The condition was simply that I appear in person to formally claim the estate within 30 days of being notified, and that I submit to a verification process confirming my identity and the legitimacy of our prior marriage. Standard probate procedure, made more complex by the size of the estate, and the parties likely to contest it. Richard's tone was careful and professional. He did not volunteer more than he needed to, but he also did not seem hostile. He seemed, if anything, quietly sympathetic. The second call was to a family law attorney here in Columbus named Sandra Okafor, whose name I'd found online at 6 a.m. while drinking my first cup of decaf and reading reviews with the focus of someone who needed to be absolutely certain. Sandra had a 4.9-star rating, 15 years of experience, and a review from a woman named Tanya K. that said simply, "She fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." I made an appointment for Thursday. The third call was to my older sister, Joanna, who lived in Pittsburgh, and who answered the phone on the first ring despite it being 8:47 in the morning on a Wednesday because Joanna is the kind of person who answers phones. "Derek left," I said. "He took everything, and I'm going to need you." There was a brief silence, and then Joanna said, "I'm getting in the car right now." She arrived by 2 in the afternoon. She brought groceries, a casserole from her freezer, and a fury so contained and precise that it actually steadied me. Joanna had always been the one in our family who got quiet when she was angry. Not explosive, not dramatic, just very still and very focused. Watching her unpack groceries with that stillness reminded me that I came from women who survived things. By Thursday, seated across from Sandra Okafor in a clean, sunlit office on High Street, I had the beginning of a plan. The plan had 2 tracks that would run simultaneously. The first addressed the legal crisis Derek had created. Sandra explained that the joint account transfer would likely be classified as marital asset dissipation. Derek had moved the money without my knowledge or consent during the marriage. That was a recoverable position in Ohio divorce law, though recovering it meant finding Derek first. Sandra recommended a private investigator she had worked with before, a former Columbus PD detective named Ray Kowalski. He was good, she said. He was quiet. And he was fast. The second track, New York. Richard Albrecht and Thomas's estate. Here's what I hadn't told Sandra yet because I was still processing it myself. Thomas Hartwell hadn't been a wealthy man when I married him in 2013. He had been a 28-year-old software developer with student debt and a studio apartment in Brooklyn who made me laugh and cooked elaborate Sunday dinners and believed, with an earnestness that I had found both endearing and slightly reckless, that he was going to build something great. We had loved each other genuinely. We had also been young and incompatible in practical ways that took us 3 years to fully admit. Different visions for where we wanted to live, whether to have children, how to balance ambition with presence. Our divorce in 2017 had been sad, but not bitter. We had parted as people who respected each other. I had not kept close track of what Thomas had done afterward, except to know vaguely through mutual friends that his company had grown into something significant. Apparently, it had grown into something worth $112 million. Why had he left it to me? That question pulled at me during the drive back from Sandra's office, during dinner with Joanna, during the hour I spent assembling the nursery furniture because I needed something physical to do with my hands. Maybe because we had no children together and his family was complicated. Maybe because despite everything, he had trusted me. Maybe because he had known, in the way that dying people sometimes know things that I might need it. Whatever his reason, I intended to honor it by claiming what he had left me. But to do that, I needed to survive the next 30 days. And surviving the next 30 days meant being smart, being fast, and being absolutely unwilling to let anyone, Derek, his mother Patricia, whoever else might see opportunity in my vulnerability, push me off balance. I wrote the plan out on my legal pad in 2 clean columns. On one side, legal steps, timeline, contacts. On the other side, a single sentence underlined twice. Do not trust anyone you haven't chosen. It was the most useful thing I wrote that week. I flew to New York on a Friday morning, 7 months pregnant, carrying a manila folder with my original marriage certificate, my divorce decree, 2 forms of photo ID, and a copy of the email Richard Albrecht had sent confirming my appointment. Joanna had wanted to come with me. I told her to stay in Columbus, to keep an eye on the house, and to call me if anything unusual happened. She didn't argue. She understood that this was mine to do. Richard Albrecht's office was on the 32nd floor of a building on Lexington Avenue. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his early 60s with the careful manners of someone who spent his professional life delivering complicated news to people in difficult circumstances. He shook my hand, offered me water and a chair that was lower than I expected, the kind of unconscious design choice that makes the visitor feel slightly less powerful. And he sat down across from me with Thomas's file open in front of him. Thomas had died of a cardiac event. He was 38 years old. He had built a company, a data infrastructure firm called Hartwell Systems, that had been acquired 18 months earlier for a figure that had made technology news. After taxes and certain disbursements, the liquid estate was valued at $112 million. He updated his will 14 months ago, Richard said. After the acquisition closed, he named you as primary beneficiary. Did he say why? I asked. Richard looked at me with something that was not quite a smile. He wrote a letter. He asked that I give it to you in person. He slid an envelope across the desk. I didn't open it there. I put it in my folder and pressed my hand flat against it and asked Richard to walk me through the verification process. The process was straightforward on paper, but complex in execution because, as Richard had anticipated, there were interested parties who intended to contest the will. Thomas's 2 business partners, men named Griffin Walsh and Stephen Cho, both of whom had been with the company from their early years, had already retained counsel. They were arguing that Thomas had lacked testamentary capacity when he updated his will, a claim Richard called aggressive and poorly supported but not ignorable. Thomas's mother, a woman I had met exactly 3 times, had filed a separate objection, arguing that as an ex-wife I had no legal standing. That claim was weaker, Richard said. Ohio and New York courts had both upheld inheritance rights of former spouses when specifically named in a valid will. The 30-day clock was running. I had arrived on day 15. I left Richard's office with a legal engagement letter, a list of documents I needed to gather, and the sealed envelope in my folder. I walked 3 blocks to a coffee shop, sat down in a corner booth, ordered chamomile tea, and opened the letter. Thomas's handwriting was the same as I remembered it. Neat, slightly tilted to the right, always with a fountain pen. Megan. If you're reading this, then Richard found you and you came. I knew you would. You were always the person who showed up. I won't make this long. I've thought about what I want to say for months, and I keep coming back to simple. You were the best part of a chapter of my life that I look back on with more gratitude than regret. I don't have anyone else I trust the way I trusted you. Take care of yourself. Take care of whoever you're taking care of now. Thomas. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and went back to work. By the time I landed in Columbus that evening, Ray Kowalski, the private investigator Sandra had recommended, had already made progress. He called me at 9 p.m. while I was sitting on the edge of my bed, still in my travel clothes. I found where the money went, he said. He didn't soften it. 3 transfers, like you said. First 2 went to a joint account held by Derek Voss and a woman named Crystal Simmons. Third transfer, $31,000, went to a property down payment in Scottsdale, Arizona, deeds filed under both their names. Crystal Simmons. I had never heard the name before. But in the way that the worst confirmations of the worst suspicions land, not with shock, but with a horrible, settling weight, I understood immediately who she was. The hotel receipt from Cincinnati, the late nights, the careful tenderness of those final weeks when Derek had been at his most attentive. He had been planning to leave. She had been waiting for him to arrive. How long? I asked. Account was opened 14 months ago, Ray said. Based on what I've seen, the relationship's at least that old. 14 months. My daughter had been conceived 11 months ago, which meant that while I was pregnant, while I was navigating a high-risk first trimester, while I was frightened and vulnerable and reaching for my husband in the night, he had already built another life. He had already decided. I didn't speak for a moment. Miss Hartwell. Ray's voice was neutral, professional. Send me everything, I said. Every document, every transaction record. I need it for Sandra by Monday morning. Already compiling it, you'll have it by Sunday. I hung up and sat very still in my room. Outside, Columbus was doing whatever Columbus does on a Friday night. Traffic and restaurant noise and the distant sound of a dog barking. Normal life. Other people's normal life continuing on schedule. I opened my legal pad to a new page. At the top I wrote, Crystal Simmons, Scottsdale. I wrote the date. I underlined it. This was the point of no return, not Derek's disappearance. That had happened to me. This was the moment I chose to stop receiving and start acting. I had the evidence. I had the attorney. I had the investigator. I had a $112 million inheritance that was mine if I could hold my ground for 15 more days. And I had the absolute bone-deep certainty that Derek had made his last calculation about what Megan Claire Hartwell would and would not do. He was wrong. The following week moved with a kind of brutal efficiency that I had not known I was capable of. Sandra filed the formal complaint with the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas on Monday morning. Marital asset dissipation, abandonment, petition for emergency protective order on the remaining marital property, including the house. Ray's documentation was airtight. Bank records, property records from Scottsdale, the timeline of transactions correlated with Derek's salary deposits and withdrawals. It was, Sandra told me, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who appreciates clean evidence, as solid a dissipation case as she had seen in years. In New York, Richard Albrecht's team filed the formal acceptance of Thomas's estate on my behalf and submitted my verification documents to the probate court. The business partners, Walsh and Cho, had escalated their contest, retaining a second firm and filing a motion to delay probate proceedings pending a psychiatric evaluation of Thomas's decision-making in the months before his death. Richard called the move transparent. He also called it something that would cost them time and money they would ultimately not recover. He advised patience. Patience, I was discovering, is a skill you build by having no other choice. What I had not anticipated was Patricia Voss. Derek's mother called on Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside me, reviewing the documents Sandra had sent for my signature. My phone lit up with Patricia's name, and I stared at it for 3 full seconds before I answered. Megan. Her voice was the same, dry, precise, with a quality that had always made me feel like I was being measured against a standard she hadn't shared with me. I think we should talk." "What would you like to talk about, Patricia?" "About what you're doing." A pause. "About this situation. Derek told me about the inheritance, about the will." Derek had told her. Of course he had. They were in contact. Mother and son coordinating in real time while I had been sitting on my bedroom floor 3 weeks ago, unable to breathe. I kept my voice completely level. "What about it?" I asked. "Megan, I know my son made a terrible mistake. I'm not defending what he did." She never convinced me of this, not even for a moment. "But you filing these legal complaints, you're making this into something that will hurt everyone, including your daughter. Do you really want your child to grow up in the shadow of a war between her parents?" There it was, the baby, deployed as an instrument of pressure. I had been waiting for it. "Patricia," I said, "your son took $94,000 from our joint account, purchased a property in Arizona with another woman, and abandoned his pregnant wife. I didn't make this into anything. I'm responding to what he created. Those are two very different things. If you push this, Derek will fight you on the house. He has legal standing as co-owner. This could drag on for years." Her voice had sharpened, the pretense of maternal concern thinning visibly. "And that inheritance, his lawyers are already looking into it. You were divorced from that man. There may be questions about whether you exercised undue influence over him in his final months." I pulled my legal pad toward me and wrote, "Patricia, threat re-house, undue influence claim." I underlined it. "I'll let my attorney handle the house," I said, "and Richard Albrecht can speak to Thomas's state of mind. Is there anything else?" A silence, then, "I'm just trying to protect my family." "I understand that," I said. "I'm trying to protect mine." I hung up. The next call came 48 hours later, and it was not Patricia. It was a man identifying himself as a representative of Derek's legal team, a name I didn't recognize, speaking in the smooth, practiced tones of someone who delivers threats professionally. He told me that Derek was prepared to file a counter-petition contesting my claim to the marital home on the grounds that I had constructively abandoned the marital relationship by pursuing an inheritance from a prior spouse, that the stress of legal proceedings could be documented as harmful to a high-risk pregnancy, that a family court judge would not look favorably upon a woman who chose aggressive litigation over the welfare of her unborn child. I let him finish. Then I said, "Please send any further communications to my attorney, Sandra Okafor. Her contact information is on the complaint that was filed Monday. Have a good afternoon." I called Sandra immediately. She was, if possible, even less impressed by Derek's legal strategy than Richard had been by Walsh and Cho's. "The constructive abandonment claim is invented," she said flatly, "and threatening a pregnant woman with her pregnancy in a court proceeding is exactly the kind of move that plays badly in front of a judge. If they file it, they file it. We'll respond." They filed a limited motion on Thursday. Sandra responded on Friday. By Friday afternoon, Derek's motion had been denied without prejudice, and the protective order on the marital home had been confirmed. It was, in the dry language of court documents, a procedural victory. To me, sitting in Sandra's office at 4 p.m. on a Friday with 20 days until my due date and the spring sun coming through the windows, it felt like the first clean breath I had taken in a month. Patricia called once more that evening. I let it go to voicemail. Crystal Simmons, I later learned from Ray, had attempted to reach me through Instagram, sending a message that I chose not to read. Some doors don't need to be opened. That weekend I stopped. Joanna had come back from Pittsburgh with her overnight bag and a clear, unspoken understanding that I needed 2 days of existing rather than fighting. We watched movies I had seen before and didn't have to think about. We ate food she cooked. We assembled the last pieces of the nursery furniture, and I sat in the rocking chair in the corner of the small yellow room and let myself feel, for the first time in weeks, not like a person executing a strategy, but like a woman about to become a mother. My daughter kicked, strong and reliable the way she always did at night. I put my hand on my stomach and I let the quiet hold me for a while. 3 days after my small private weekend of recovery, Crystal Simmons found my phone number. I don't know how she got it. Ray suspected Derek had given it to her, either directly or by leaving his contacts accessible. A careless act or a calculated one, depending on how generous you were inclined to be. My phone rang on a Tuesday morning while I was at my prenatal appointment, waiting in the exam room in that particular suspended time before the doctor arrives. I saw an Arizona area code, and I answered it out of something I can only describe as controlled curiosity. Megan? Her voice was younger than I'd expected, a little uncertain. "This is Crystal. I think you know who I am." "I do," I said. A pause. I wanted to talk to you. Not through lawyers, just person to person." Another pause. Longer. "I know what Derek did to you was wrong. I want you to know I didn't know about the savings account. When I found out, I told him he needed to fix it." I looked at the anatomy poster on the wall of the exam room, and I chose my words deliberately. "Crystal, I appreciate that you called. I genuinely don't have any anger toward you personally. That's not a productive way for me to spend my energy right now." I paused. "But I need you to understand that whatever conversations you had with Derek about what he needed to fix are between the two of you. My legal process is proceeding. That won't change." That's sort of what I wanted to talk about." Her voice shifted. It became slightly warmer, slightly more confidential, as if we were moving into honest territory. "Derek is willing to return $50,000. Voluntarily, without a court order. He just needs the legal filings dropped. He said it would be better for the baby. Less stress. He said you could have the house clear. He'd sign off on everything if you just moved on." There it was. $50,000 of $94,000. 53 cents on the dollar for what he had taken, plus the house I was already legally entitled to, in exchange for ending the proceedings that were making his life uncomfortable. It was dressed up as generosity. It was, in practice, an offer designed to make me feel like I was winning something while ensuring I absorbed a $44,000 loss and walked away from a legal record that would follow Derek Voss for years. Did he think I wouldn't understand that? Or did he simply think that I was tired enough and frightened enough and pregnant enough to take what was offered rather than fight for what was right? "Tell Derek," I said, "to speak to my attorney. Megan." "Crystal." My voice was even. Not cold. I wasn't performing coldness. I was simply, genuinely unmoved. "I'm about to have my last prenatal appointment before my daughter arrives. I'd like to be present for it. I wish you well." I ended the call, set my phone face down on the chair beside me, and took 3 slow breaths. The doctor came in 7 minutes later. My daughter's heartbeat was strong. Her position was good. Everything was on track. Walking out of that clinic into the mild May afternoon, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Clarity. Not the anxious, tactical clarity of the past weeks. The clarity of someone who has stopped weighing options and simply knows. I drove home and called Joanna. Then I called my closest friend from my years as an analyst, a woman named Dana Park, who had left the field to run her own consulting firm, and who had the particular quality of listening that makes you feel seen rather than advised. I told Dana most of it. Not every legal detail, but the shape of it. The money, Derek, Thomas's letter, the baby, Crystal's call. Dana was quiet for a moment, then she said, What do you need from me specifically? I loved her for that, for not assuming, for asking. Just to know that what I'm doing makes sense to someone who knows me, I said, someone who isn't being paid to tell me I'm right. What you're doing, Dana said, makes complete sense. And for what it's worth, I've known you for 11 years, and I have never once seen you make a decision you hadn't thought all the way through. Derek picked the wrong person to underestimate. There was a support group, too, which I hadn't expected to find useful, but did. Sandra had mentioned it almost in passing, a group that met at a community center in Clintonville for women navigating divorce and custody situations. I went once that week on a Thursday evening and sat in a circle of 9 other women in folding chairs in a room that smelled like coffee and institutional carpet, and I listened. I didn't share much. I wasn't ready to tell my story in that compressed, summarized way that support groups sometimes require. But I listened to other women describe the specific arithmetic of what had been taken from them. Not just money, but certainty, trust, the particular safety of believing the person beside you is who they say they are. And I recognized it completely. I came home that night and I thought, I am not uniquely broken. I am not uniquely weak. I am one of many women who were handed something impossible and chose to carry it anyway. That thought did more for me than a week of tactical planning. Somewhere in Scottsdale, I assumed, Derek and Crystal were watching, waiting for the settlement offer to land, calculating how long a pregnant woman, alone and financially drained, could sustain a 2-front legal battle. Let them calculate. I had never been better at math than I was right now. Patricia Voss arrived at my door on a Saturday morning. I had not invited her. I had not expected her. I opened the door because I heard the knock and I was, that morning, alone in the house. Joanna had gone back to Pittsburgh the night before, with a plan to return when the baby came. And for one unguarded moment before I saw who it was, I had the irrational hope that it might be someone bringing something good. It was Patricia, in a pale blue blazer and carefully applied lipstick, holding a small paper bag from a bakery I vaguely recognized from Clintonville. She smiled at me. It was the warmest smile she'd ever directed at me in the 8 years I had known her. I thought we could talk properly, she said, without lawyers, without phones, just the two of us. I considered closing the door. Then I made a different calculation. Let her in. See what she brings. Know your opponent's position. I stepped back and let her enter. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with my legal pad at 2 a.m. 6 weeks earlier, counting what I had lost. Patricia set the bakery bag down. She poured coffee without being asked, which meant she was performing comfort, demonstrating familiarity with my home, reminding me subliminally that she'd been in this kitchen before and knew where things were. I noticed it and said nothing. Megan, she began, I have been thinking about this constantly, about what Derek did, about what you're going through, about your daughter. She placed her hands flat on the table, an open palm gesture of sincerity. I want to be honest with you. Please, I said. Derek is struggling. She said it with the precise measure of maternal sorrow that she had clearly rehearsed. He made a catastrophic mistake. He knows that. But this legal war you're conducting, it's destroying him. And I'm frightened that it's going to destroy the possibility of him being a father to your daughter. She paused. Children need their fathers, Megan. I know you know that. I watched her hands. They were very still. And the inheritance, she continued, her voice softening into something that was almost gentle. Thomas Hartwell's money. Megan, I've spoken to people who knew him, people in that industry. There are stories about that company, about how it was built. There may be things you don't know about where that money came from. If the business partners contest the estate and those stories surface, it could reflect on you. It could look very bad. It could look like you were involved. She let the word hang. There it was, the implied threat wearing the face of concern. Drop the legal action against Derek and also quietly walk away from Thomas's estate, or we will find a way to smear you in the process. I looked at Patricia Voss across my kitchen table and I felt the first genuine flicker of fear I had felt in weeks. Not because her threat was credible. Richard had already told me that Walsh and Cho's contest was poorly supported and that Thomas's business practices were cleanly documented, but because of the sheer willingness of it. The willingness to sit in my kitchen with a bakery bag, performing warmth, and simultaneously insinuate that I might be implicated in something corrupt. To use my unborn daughter as leverage. To do all of it with that careful, practiced smile. This was not a woman who had come to make peace. This was a woman who had come to measure whether I could be broken by something softer than a direct assault. "Patricia," I said, and I was proud of how steady my voice was. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You're suggesting that if I continue my legal proceedings against Derek, there may be reputational consequences for me connected to Thomas's estate. Is that right?" She blinked. She hadn't expected me to name it so plainly. "I'm simply saying there are complications. And you're also suggesting that my daughter needs her father present in her life, which is true, and which is something I intend to address through the family court system, where Derek's responsibilities as a parent will be clearly established along with his financial obligations." I paused, which is exactly why the legal proceedings exist, not to destroy Derek, to establish accountability. Patricia's smile had faded. What replaced it was something harder and more honest. "You're making a mistake," she said. Her voice had lost its warmth entirely. "You think you're in a strong position. You're not. You're a woman about to give birth alone, with an ongoing legal battle in 2 states. Derek has resources and he has family. You have, what? A sister in Pittsburgh and an old attorney on retainer?" "I have a very good attorney," I said, "and a very good probate lawyer, and documentation that is, I'm told, quite airtight." I stood up, carefully because standing quickly was no longer comfortable, and I said, "I appreciate you coming, Patricia. I hope you'll pass along to Derek that any communication about our daughter should go through Sandra Okafor. I'll show you out." She left the bakery bag on the table. I didn't touch it. After she was gone, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment with my hand pressed against the back of a chair, and I let the fear I had suppressed during the conversation exist fully for 30 seconds. It was real. Patricia's threat was empty, but her willingness to make it was not. It told me that they were frightened, that they were watching the legal position tighten, and they didn't have a good move, and so they had sent a woman with a bakery bag to try to soften me into retreat. The fear lasted 30 seconds. Then it turned into something else. There is a particular quality to the anger of a woman who has been handled one time too many. It is not hot, it is not loud, it is very, very quiet, and it sits just below the sternum, and it does not go away. I went to my desk and I called Sandra. "They're scared," Sandra said, after I told her about Patricia's visit. "That's good. Scared people make mistakes. Let them." I wrote one line on my legal pad. They blinked. 2 weeks until my due date. My daughter was born on May 28th. Her name is Eleanor. She arrived 6 days before her due date, which felt appropriate. The women in my family have never waited for permission. Labor was long, and I won't describe all of it except to say that Joanna was there, and a nurse named Beverly, who had the steady, unhurried manner of someone who has attended many difficult births and views drama as a clinical inconvenience, and that when Eleanor finally arrived at 4:17 in the morning in a hospital room in Columbus, Ohio, she was pink and loud and absolutely certain of her own presence in the world. I held her against my chest in the thin morning light, and I felt for a few hours that nothing else existed. Then the world resumed. Richard Albrecht called on day 28 of the 30-day window, 2 days before my deadline, to tell me that the probate court had scheduled the formal hearing for the following week and that Walsh and Cho had made a strategic error. In attempting to obtain Thomas's psychiatric records to support their testamentary capacity claim, they had triggered a review process that had instead surfaced a detailed memo Thomas had written 14 months earlier, 3 months after updating his will, explicitly documenting his reasoning for the bequest. He had anticipated the contest. He had left behind a written record, signed and notarized, explaining that he had chosen me as beneficiary because he trusted my judgment with significant resources, because he had no children and no spouse, and because his business partners had demonstrated in the 18 months following the acquisition a pattern of financial decisions he found ethically troubling. The memo, Richard said, was the most useful document he had seen in 20 years of probate law. Walsh and Cho's attorneys, upon reviewing it, withdrew the testamentary capacity claim the following morning. Their second motion, disputing the estate's liquid valuation, remained, but Richard assessed it as a delaying tactic that would ultimately fail. I called Richard from the hospital room with Eleanor asleep in the bassinet beside me, and I said, "Tell me exactly what happens next. Next week, you appear at the hearing. You present your documents. I present Thomas's memo and your verification materials. The court confirms your standing as primary beneficiary. The contest from Walsh and Cho proceeds on the valuation question, which will take months to fully resolve, but the primary inheritance is protected. You have won the essential argument." I looked at Eleanor. "All right," I said, "I'll be there." The hearing was in Manhattan, 8 days after Eleanor's birth. My obstetrician, a careful woman who knew my full situation and had chosen not to add to my burdens, cleared me to travel with specific conditions. No lifting, limited standing time, immediate return if anything felt wrong. Joanna came with me and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Eleanor because newborns are not admitted to probate proceedings. And I walked into that courtroom in a blue dress I had bought specifically for this occasion. Practical, professional, slightly too large for my current body because the dress was from before the pregnancy and I had not had time to buy new. And I sat at the table beside Richard Albrecht and I waited. Walsh and Cho were there. Griffin Walsh was a tall man in his 50s, with the kind of assured posture that comes from having won most of the arguments he'd participated in. Stephen Cho was quieter, watching me from across the room with an expression I couldn't read. Their legal team was 3 people, 2 attorneys and a paralegal with a rolling cart of documents. Richard had 1 associate and a slim folder. The judge was a woman named Honorable Carolyn Marsh, who had the efficient, unsentimental manner of someone who has heard every variety of human dispute and classifies them all under the same heading, resolvable. Walsh and Cho's attorney went first. He was articulate and well-prepared, but he was arguing without his strongest claim, the testamentary capacity argument, and the absence showed. He leaned heavily on the notion that an ex-wife's claim to such a substantial estate was extraordinary and should be viewed with heightened scrutiny, a framing that Judge Marsh interrupted twice with questions about the specific legal basis for applying scrutiny to a validly named beneficiary. Then Richard presented the marriage certificate, the divorce decree, demonstrating a non-acrimonious separation with no ongoing disputes, my identity verification, Thomas's updated will, and then, last, Thomas's memo. 14 months old, signed, notarized, and written with the precision of a man who had known exactly what he was doing and had wanted there to be no ambiguity about it. Walsh's attorney asked to cross-examine me. Judge Marsh permitted it with a brevity that suggested she was granting the courtesy rather than expecting it to be productive. He asked me when I had last spoken to Thomas before his death. I told him, 3 years ago, a brief email exchange about the forwarding of some old mail. He asked me whether Thomas had ever indicated in any communication his intention to leave me his estate. I told him no, that I had been completely unaware of his intentions until Richard's phone call. So you had no relationship with Mr. Hartwell in the years leading up to his death, Walsh's attorney said, in a tone that implied this was a point in his favor. That's correct, I said, and yet he chose me. That was his decision to make. Walsh, seated at the table, said something quietly to his attorney. His attorney held up a hand. They conferred for approximately 15 seconds. Then something remarkable happened. Walsh stood up, without being asked to speak, without consulting his team. He looked at me across the courtroom and he said, with the raw frustration of a man who has been watching a carefully constructed position collapse all morning, "She manipulated him. She had to have. Tom wouldn't have done this otherwise. She was always... Tom talked about her. She had influence over him." Judge Marsh looked at Walsh with an expression of complete neutrality. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "you are not counsel of record in this matter, and you are not a witness. Please sit down. She's taking everything he built." "Mr. Walsh." The judge's voice did not rise. It simply became more precise. "Sit down, or I will ask the bailiff to escort you from the courtroom." Walsh sat down. His face was flushed. His attorney placed a hand on his arm and leaned in to speak to him. Cho, beside him, was looking at the table. I sat very still. I did not look at Walsh. I looked at Judge Marsh, and I waited. The judge completed her review in a silence that lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Then she confirmed, in the measured language of court proceedings, that my documentation was satisfactory, that the testamentary capacity claim had been withdrawn, and that my standing as primary beneficiary of Thomas Evan Hartwell's estate was formally recognized. The valuation dispute brought by Walsh and Cho was referred to a mediation process that would run parallel to the estate's administration. Outside the courtroom, in the marble corridor of the building, Richard shook my hand. "That outburst will not help them in mediation," he said quietly. "It's now on the record." "I know," I said. Joanna was at the end of the corridor with Eleanor, who was awake and unimpressed with the grandeur of her surroundings. I walked toward them, and when I reached them, I took my daughter and held her against my shoulder, and I let the relief, the enormous, months-delayed relief, come. In the weeks that followed the hearing, things moved with the quiet, grinding efficiency of institutional processes finally running in the right direction. In New York, the mediation between Richard's team and Walsh and Cho's attorneys concluded 3 months later. The estate's liquid value was confirmed at $109.4 million. Their attempt to relitigate their original acquisition terms was dismissed without consideration. Walsh and Cho received nothing beyond what they had already been paid years earlier. I was informed of the final estate confirmation on a Tuesday morning while Eleanor slept in her crib. I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table with Joanna on the phone, asking about Eleanor's sleeping schedule. "Joe," I said, "it's done." 2 seconds of silence, then, "All of it?" "All of it." In Columbus, Sandra's work concluded with equal finality. The accumulated weight of documented evidence was simply too great. Ray Kowalski had continued his work quietly in the background and produced a supplementary report capturing additional transfers Sandra's original filing hadn't included. The Franklin County judge was not sympathetic to Derek's position. She awarded me the marital home free and clear, full restitution of the $94,000 plus interest, and established Derek's child support obligations based on his documented income, rather than the reduced circumstances he had tried to claim. Derek paid the restitution in 2 installments. He signed the house transfer paperwork through his attorney. He did not call. He did not write. He sent nothing for Eleanor. Patricia called Joanna once, not me, asking that things be civil going forward. Joanna told her, in the quiet, final way Joanna delivers conclusions, that civility was my decision to make. Patricia did not call again. Crystal Simmons filed a civil claim against Derek in Arizona court, alleging he had induced her to co-invest using funds he had misrepresented as legitimately his. That particular drama was entirely their own. Walsh and Cho settled into chastened silence. Griffin Walsh gave a carefully worded interview to a technology publication that was read, by anyone familiar with the case, as the face-saving exercise of a man who had been publicly embarrassed and knew it. In October, on a clear fall afternoon with Eleanor on my hip and the maple tree blazing orange in the backyard, I walked through the house and felt it as mine. Fully, completely mine. Everything Derek had counted on, my panic, my collapse, my willingness to accept crumbs, had been his mistake, not mine. Everything was closed. The year that followed was the quietest of my adult life, in the best possible sense. I didn't rush. I stayed in Columbus through Eleanor's first winter and watched her discover the world the way babies do. The ceiling fan, Joanna's voice, the patch of afternoon light through the nursery window, she regarded with the gravity of a philosopher encountering a genuinely new idea. Joanna came every other weekend. Dana flew in from San Francisco. My mother came in December and held Eleanor for 6 hours without appearing to notice anything else in the house. In spring, I donated significantly to maternal health access, legal aid for women in domestic financial abuse situations, and the tech education program Thomas's company had funded. The remainder I structured conservatively with Richard's guidance. There was no urgency to anything. What happened to the others? Derek and Crystal lasted 14 months before her civil case stripped him of the Scottsdale property. He was renting in Phoenix, working below his former level, visiting Eleanor rarely and only under court supervision. Patricia and Derek had stopped speaking within the year. Griffin Walsh resigned from 2 advisory boards after the estate proceedings generated quiet but pointed coverage in the business press. None of it was perfect justice. But on a September afternoon, Eleanor pulled herself to standing, using the slats of my chair, balanced on uncertain legs, and looked at me with an expression that held both triumph and a genuine question about whether the world was always going to be this interesting. I told her yes. I believed it completely.